You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
You take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday of getting back at you.
We're living in a very dangerous time right now, and liberalism has lost their cotton-picking mind.
The Trump folks, if they found out how we knew what we knew about the Trump staff's dealing with Russians, that they would try to compromise those sources and methods.
Nobody ever said anything about resisting Obama. They went at him on legitimate arguments.
I really do believe that much of what you saw coming out of Trump's mouth was a play from Putin's playbook.
Welcome to the Abolitionists Round Table, your all-access pass to exposing fake news, the resistance, and Barack Obama's shadow government undermining American progress. Be a part of the conversation at 734-822-1600. And now, your all-American hosts, Del Marsh and Phil Stargell.
Good morning. This is the Abolitionist Round Table, but this is not Del Marsh, and this is not Phil Stargell. This is Janice Daniels. Remember me? How could you forget? Well, that's a rhetorical question. I really don't want to hear you answer. He loves me not. Ladies, do you remember that game we used to play? You know, you pick a petal off a flower every time you say, he loves me, and then you pick off the next petal and you say, he loves me not. And the phrase that you end up with when you pick off the last petal, that determines whether or not he loves you. I wish it was that easy. I truly do. But wait, I better be careful. The libs might decide to start a new organization called PETOF, People for the Ethical Treatment of Flowers. Liberals. I do believe that Michael Savage was mostly right when he said that liberalism is a mental disorder. I think he would have been more appropriate if he would have said liberalism is a dangerous mental disorder. I can't even stand to watch the television anymore. I actually like to call it the electronic cesspool. That wasn't my nomenclature. It was Vicki Weaver who first said that, or at least the first time I heard it said. It was Vicki Weaver who said it. You remember Vicki Weaver? Yeah, she was the wife of Randy Weaver. She was shot in the head in 1992 at Ruby Ridge by an FBI sniper while her 16-year-old daughter looked on and while she was holding her 10-month-old baby in her arms. You should read up on that story if you're too young to remember it. It is a case of abuse of power. Now, that said, I'm a full 100% supporter of our law enforcement community. I love the rule of law. I love the Constitution. But I do know that power is easily abused, and that's why the people must understand the law. We must know our Constitution, and we have to hold our leaders accountable. And that's why you should listen to great radio stations like Wham Talk 1600. Because the greatest gift that God has given us is our minds and our ability to listen and to analyze, to interpret, and to learn, and then use what we've learned to do our part in the continuum of humanity to ensure that men stay free. I like to associate with people of like mind, brave men and women, many of you who are listening today, and I want to thank you for doing all that you can in your part to defend our constitutional republic. I have on our hotline today one of the bravest men that I personally know in this local area, and I know a lot of brave men. I'm going to hit the talk one button. Hopefully I have brought on Pete Hendrickson. Pete is the author of a fascinating book called Cracking the Code. Good morning, Pete.
Good morning, Janice. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you as well. Pete is going to be our featured speaker at the Michigan Conservative Union Southeast Chapter meeting in Troy, Michigan on this coming Tuesday, August 8th in the evening at 7 o'clock. That'll be at the American Polish Cultural Center, and you should get your papers and pencils out because Pete is going to make a presentation that's a must-see for everyone who loves our Constitution and the concrete limits that it places on our government and the taxes that you are erroneously paying to feed the Leviathan. Our meeting on the 8th is called Starve the Beast. And if we learn and apply the truth about constitutional taxation, we could, not we might, not we should, but we could actually drain the swamp by starving it. Pete, your book is so fascinating, and you kind of say that it's easy read, but it really is not. It's very detailed and it's very in-depth, and I want to kind of set it up with a news report at Breitbart that I saw on Sunday, July 29th, where former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich predicted that the 2018 election would be tough for Republicans without tax reform by Thanksgiving. He added, if we can run for re-election as the party of prosperity and jobs and take-home pay, we're going to be golden, and the American people are going to vote to keep the Republicans in. If we end up in a situation where we are not able to really show the kind of economic activity that we need, then I think we can have a very tough election next year. Ya think? Pete, I need you to tell me, what does real tax reform look like?
Well, it looks like doing nothing in a certain sense, Janice. We don't need any kind of reform in our legal structure, our legal structure regarding the tax. What we have in terms of the income tax is a tax structure that is so not only benign but desirable that the American people about 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, actually amended the Constitution in order to preserve the function of the income tax. But
so
that's the function of the income tax as it's actually written, as opposed to the income tax most people are accustomed to today, which for the last 75 years or so has been administered not as it is written. It's been actually misadministered, very deliberately so, capitalizing on a widespread misunderstanding of the nature of the tax that had been kind of nurtured by progressive interests over the course of the first third or so of the 20th century. And during the tumult of World War II, the revenue-hungry state recognized what it perceived as an opportunity to initiate the misapplication of the tax with a distracted and to an unfortunately large extent
well, that actually, Pete,
population at that point.
that actually happened before World War II. It happened, I think, with President Lincoln, where we were led to believe that, in fact, on this day, August 5th, 1861, he imposed the first federal income tax, and that's not true. I like to go back to the Constitution, and where I see the first reference to tax in the Constitution is Article 1, Section 8. It says, Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States. Now, and it goes on to say, but all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. Now, my understanding of your premise is that the income tax is an excise tax. And if that's so, why does the Constitution lay out those 4 different revenue streams as if there's something different?
Well, the distinction that's being drawn with the list in Article 1, Section 8 is from the specification in Article 1, Section 2 and also Section 9, in which direct taxes, capitations and other direct taxes are discussed, and the limitation of apportionment is placed on those particular types of taxes. So the Article 1, Section 8 taxes are distinct from the capitations or other direct taxes in that they refer to indirect taxes, a whole different category of animal than direct taxes. The framers, the founding generation, was very, very sensitive to the taxation issue. It was one of the key factors in the revolutionary thinking, and one of the key offenses of the English state from which the revolutionaries were revolting. The distinction between the two essentially can be summed up in this way. Direct taxes are taxes that are initiated at by the taxing authority itself as a matter of decree, essentially. Indirect taxes are taxes that are initiated on the action of the person subject to the tax or who will become subject to the tax because of that voluntarily chosen activity that's engaged in.
Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't think that I'm well enough versed in your philosophy to understand what you just said, to be quite honest with you, direct or indirect tax. It doesn't say in the Constitution that there's a differentiation between taxes, duties, imposts, and excises that the Congress has the power to lay and collect. So where now I do see in Article 4 or Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4, no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. So that's where I see capitation, and that means direct. But please, could you, more in a layman's term, define the difference between direct and indirect taxes, please?
Only by description, I think. That's the only way I could modify what I have already said. I'm going to repeat what I said, and just to set the stage for that. A direct tax is a tax that is imposed by the decision of the taxer. An indirect tax is a tax that arises as a consequence of a choice made by the one who will become subject to the tax. That's the fundamental distinction. If the government taxes you directly, it does it because it has said, acting on authority that it possesses, I want to take some of your stuff. An indirect tax is where the individual who will become subject to the tax says, I'm going to decide to do this thing upon which a tax will arise. And I'm aware of the fact that a tax will arise if I do this particular thing, but I view it to be in my interest to do the thing. It will be profitable to me even with the tax burden that will arise. So two different things entirely. One is a voluntary a choice on the part of an election on the part of the individual who will be subject to the tax as a consequence. The other is not. The distinction that the framers draw under the rules of taxation that we've just been talking about, Article 1, Section 9, for instance, Article 1, Section 8, and the Article 1, Section 9 rule is previewed at an earlier point in the Constitution as well, as being the only thing that's in the Constitution twice. The meaningful application of that is that the apportionment rule requires that the total amount of tax that is to be collected under the application of a capitation or direct tax or other direct tax is divided up amongst the states and imposed on the states themselves, not the people of the states, but the states themselves, the state governments, in proportion to their proportion of the national population. So a tax of $1 million would be imposed on a state that had 10% of the national population for a total of $100,000, as an example. And the state government is the one responsible for remitting that money. Now, the state government would be empowered to collect the money in any way that it was constitutionally able to under its own rules. But the actual liability falls on the state, not the people.
I see. I noticed in your on your website, which I want to mention the name of your website, it's losthorizons.com, losthorizons.com, and the audience can go there and see a vast amount of research and links to important documentation to kind of give you an idea of Pete's philosophy. Very, very important, as I see it, philosophy. But in your website, you say the federal Senate and the House set the tax that's due. For example, in 1798, they set the dollar amount to be $2 million. And then, as you say, they apportioned it to the various states based upon population. Who's to say that the federal government can't set that dollar amount to be so astronomical that it ends up being a crushing debt to every citizen of every state anyway?
Well, they can, of course, but the people making that decision are the representatives of those who will be paying the bill. And in fact, they are the representatives of the states who will be paying the bill. So what it does is the apportionment rule renders the tax burden subject to a series of increasing diffusions from the Senate and House. It diffuses out to the state governments and the state legislatures independently. And then from that, of course, to the people of the states independently, who ultimately are the ones that exercise power in state governments. So Congress is not going to successfully, anyway, lay upon its own, the states that it represents, a burden that those states are not capable of satisfying.
I see what you're saying. So in other words, what you're saying is that Gary Peters and Debbie Stabenow wouldn't be reelected time after time after time if they imposed too much of a burden on the people. That's exactly what's happening right now, though.
That's one part of it. Well, they're not imposing that burden, though. What they're doing is they're allowing the misrepresentation or misunderstanding of the income tax to operate. That's where the money is coming from. There hasn't been an actual direct tax imposed in this country in quite a long time, more than 100 years.
I see.
The other element of the diffusion concept, or an aspect of it, a related aspect perhaps, is that because of the apportionment mechanism, the overall burden that a Congress will pass, particularly under the influence of the Senate, with its two representatives from each state, won't exceed the capacity of the least affluent states to bear, because all the states will be bearing effectively the same relative burden according to their proportion of the population. So it's a dampening effect on the total volume of taxation as well, which is one of the reasons why Congress doesn't like it. Congress wants to have lots of money to spend, and the direct tax apportionment rule is a hindrance, political hindrance, very powerful political hindrance to Congress acquiring very, very large amounts of revenue. And the income tax itself was just as much a control mechanism when properly understood, which is why for the first 80 years or so of its operation, the averaged American households that actually even bothered to file an income tax return, were obliged to file an income tax return because of their qualifying for the tax, was below 10%. Today, it's in the number of households, the percentage of households that file tax returns is in the 90% neighborhood. But that's not because anything changed about the law. It's because of that effect of the misunderstanding that I referred to, that was exploited so successfully in the early 1940s.
You're listening to Wham! Talk 1600. This is the Abolitionist Round Table. Janice Daniels sitting in for our illustrious hosts, Del Marsh and Phil Stargell, and I have a very brave and interesting gentleman on the line. His name is Pete Hendrickson. He's written a book called Cracking the Code, The Fascinating Truth About Taxation in America. And he is going to be the featured speaker at the Michigan Conservative Union Southeast Chapter meeting in Troy, Michigan on Tuesday, August 8th. That's this coming Tuesday at 7 o'clock in the evening, the American Polish Cultural Center. If you want more information, you can go to either my website, janicedaniels.com, that's J-A-Nice, Daniels, as in my favorite Uncle Jack.com, janicedaniels.com, or you can go to losthorizons.com. That's Pete Hendrickson's website, and you can get a lot of information off of that website about this very important issue. In fact, Pete, you called this the taproot of all of the problems that we're facing in America today. And I liked that concept, that kind of like flowered in my mind, and I thought, wow, taproot, that is the elemental root that all vegetation is supported by.
Yeah, even the hydra-like vegetation of a leviathan.
Yeah.
Indeed, the income tax, the misapplication of the income tax is that taproot of leviathan. It is the source of fuel for all of the things that are done by the bloated state.
That's right. The lovers of big government have set up a structure that is so contrary to the Constitution and what our founding fathers expected of our limited form of government, that basically we are at a point where we have to starve the beast, and that's the title of our meeting on Tuesday the 8th in Troy. Pete Hendrickson will be giving a marvelous presentation. I saw his presentation a couple of weeks ago, and in this presentation, Pete, I think you lay out your premises so very carefully and logically, so that even the smallest of minds, even I was able to understand what you were talking about. And so that's why I wanted to bring you into the Michigan Conservative Union meeting to give that presentation again. And quite frankly, what I'd like to see at some point is if we can develop a training program so that other people, me, other leaders around the state, in fact, our legislators could actually give your presentation to all of their groups and to the legislature to be able to try to get back to that constitutional rule of law that is so desperately needed on so many different levels in this country.
Yeah, I like to point out to people that for the first 140 years of our history, we operated within the close confines of the constitutional structure designed and intended by the founders and the framers. A couple of blips in that train of years in which there were some diversions or digressions from the strict and hard rule, but for the most part, for that 140 years, we adhered very closely to the limit, and the consumption by government at all levels of the wealth produced by this amazing society was below 10%. And during that time, the most of it, we were the most prosperous and freest people in the history of the world. Since that time, since the divergence, since we've gone vastly beyond the 10% consumption of GDP by government at the federal, state, and local levels, to where we are today, where government is consuming probably around 50%. We have become the largest debtor in the history of the world as a society. Quite a transformation, not one to the good. And it began, as is demonstrable, by graphing the consumption of wealth by government. It began in the early 1940s when the misapplication of the income tax began. This is not just a correlation; it is a causal relationship, and very easily seen to be one.
Well, you know, what I like is how you define what the word income really means. It does not mean the trade that goes on in ordinary people's lives where you give your labor for your money or earnings that your employer will give you. Could you go into that aspect of the income tax? Define it for us, please.
Sure. And as a preamble to that, I want to point out to the listeners that I mentioned a little while ago that the income tax was so highly thought of that the American people in the early part of the 20th century actually amended the Constitution in order to preserve its activity. I want to reemphasize that the income tax is an extremely benign and desirable tax. It does what it is intended to do. It places a cost on the exercise of privilege of the use of public stuff by private persons to make private profits, and simply causes a part of that private profit to be returned into the public treasury, into the public hands, and the meaning of income is wrapped up with that.
So the key word that you're saying is it is money that is given to people from the public treasury for an activity that is associated with public service.
It's the activities themselves are the things that are taxed under the income tax. And when people engage in activities, profitable activities, public property or prerogatives, part of that private profit is taxed and qualifies as income.
Stay with us. We're going to have a short break. You can join the conversation. Dial 734-822-1600. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Abolitionists Round Table with your hosts, Del and Phil. They're exposing the left's underground resistance while leading the charge in the fight for liberty. Join the conversation at 734-822-1600.
Good morning, and thank you for getting up early in the morning to listen to the Abolitionist Round Table. As you can tell, this is not your regular or beloved hosts, Del Marsh or Phil Stargell. This is Janice Daniels. You can see some of my work at my website, janicedaniels.com. That's J-A-Nice. Daniels, like my favorite Uncle Jack.com, janicedaniels.com. By the way, did you happen to see the article published on Fox News that says that, let's see, half of the candidates in the Detroit mayoral election are felons? They found, the Detroit News found that 3 of the 8 mayoral hopefuls have faced gun charges, 2 for assault with intent to commit murder, and a 4th candidate pleaded guilty to a non-gun charge years ago. Under Michigan state election law, convicted felons can vote and run for office so long as they are not incarcerated or guilty of crimes breaching public trust. Isn't intent to commit murder a breach of public trust? I'm just asking. Well, this morning we're joined by a gentleman named Pete Hendrickson. He has written a very important book called Cracking the Code, and that is the fascinating truth about taxation in America. You can go to his website, losthorizons.com, to get some more information and order your copy of his really important book, again, called Cracking the Code. And we say that if you're serious about limiting the size and the scope of our government, then Pete Hendrickson is the man you need to talk to. And the book that you need to purchase is Cracking the Code. He's going to be joining us at the Michigan Conservative Union Southeast Chapter meeting on Tuesday, August 8th. That's this coming Tuesday at 7 p.m. at the American Polish Cultural Center. You can get more information by going to my website, janicedaniels.com. And Pete, I hope you're still with us.
I'm still here, Janice.
Okay, great. It's great to have you. I really think that this is an important aspect of your premises, and that is that the earnings that we trade for our labor are not to be taxed as income.
Well, let's go further than that. The earnings that are received in any fashion whatsoever are not automatically or necessarily qualified as income in the meaning of the tax laws.
Well, what do you mean by that?
Income in the tax law, income is a very specialized thing. It means gains received from the exercise of federal privileges. That's all it means. There is no type of income, quote unquote, within the context of tax law that is not a gain from the exercise of federal privilege. So income received in any fashion whatsoever, from rents, from stock dividends, from any kind of activity, any kind of gain, if it does not have a federal privilege component in its acquisition, involved in its acquisition or generation, it is not income in the sense that word is defined in tax law.
So what about the millions of dollars that our so-called public servants are gaining from various lobbyist activity or investments when they are on the public dole, as, say, Senator John McCain or someone like him?
Sure. Being paid for the exercise of a public office or administering a public office is absolutely taxable. That is the exercise of a federal privilege. No one has a right to be a U.S. Senator and get paid by the U.S. Treasury for doing so. That is a privileged event.
So then all of our public servants should be paying this tax, and
all of our federal public servants.
All of our federal public, not the state level?
No, not the state, no.
Well, that's kind of interesting.
Income tax is a federal privilege.
I see. So then the states, though, do have the ability to create their own taxes, and they do plenty of that.
Absolutely. And they, as you say, they do plenty of that.
Yeah. What form of tax, Pete, would you think is appropriate for the people, the you and me, the grassroots, me and you, who break our backs every day and go to our jobs and create what we hope to be wealth?
What do I think is the correct type of tax?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that that an indirect tax such as the income tax is exactly the correct type of tax. It's one that even as ardent a state lover as Alexander Hamilton recognized as a regulating mechanism on the size of government, and he spoke with perhaps grudging admiration of the structure of an indirect excise for that purpose, pointing out that people will choose the degree to which they will engage in the activities upon which the tax arises, and thereby regulate the size of the state and regulate their own contribution to it. That's the whole concept. The founders and the framers were big on the diffusion of power. Access to resources is one of the biggest power things that can affect both the people and the state, and this is an area where that diffusion of power was very carefully designed in recognition of its significance. So I want to clarify something, though, before we go on. State income taxes, such as the Michigan income tax, is a tax on federal activity. It is not a tax on state activity. It is, in 1939, the state governments were granted by the federal government an opportunity to tax federal activity, federal taxable activity that took place within the state borders, and so those taxes are just on the same activity that the federal tax is on. They are in fact federal taxes, even though the state lays its own claim for them. This is the reason why, for instance, at the beginning of a state form, they simply ask, "What did you put on your federal form for the amount of income, quote unquote, that was received?" Both on the same activities.
So the interesting thing is basically we should be able, people like me or you or the majority of the wage earners in our country should be able to say that we have earned $0 that is to be a tax is to be applied to.
Yeah, and another clarifying, careful qualification. Wages itself is actually a defined term in tax law. It has a special meaning. People who earn what qualify as wages in tax law actually do owe the tax, because wages in tax law only means the kind of wages paid for the exercise of federal privilege. And
wow.
That's actually a statutorily defined term. It's one of the things that has helped cause the misunderstanding that allowed the misapplication of the tax. The tax law is rife with specially defined terms that mimic common words, such as income, for instance. Income in common speech, people tend to think that means all that comes in. So
right.
Whatever money comes in the door, that qualifies as income. Well, in common speech, it perhaps does, but in tax law, it does not. Only the special subclass of what comes through the door that is a consequence of the exercise of federal privilege qualifies as income.
Well, what do you call the money that I make, for example?
Earnings, receipts, gains.
Okay.
Any of those things. Anything except income.
Or
unless
wages.
You're getting it, or wages,
I
that's
see.
right. Unless you're getting them as a consequence of...
We have a long way to go in this country towards understanding our own Constitution. You know, it might be a really good idea if maybe our kids were taught to memorize the Constitution.
Wouldn't that be good?
Wouldn't that be something?
And maybe taught logic in schools, too, as was once done.
Oh, yeah.
And history and economics. All these things were at one time actually, sub-8th grade level coursework.
Right.
Today, they don't get taught at all, and what is available even in universities is, in many cases, very skewed and manipulated subject matter. So.
You know, that's exactly why I think people like Senator John McCain can get on national television and rant about compromise and to hell with the bombastic, loud voices in radio. That's really, to me, that's another reason why he ought to resign. and really spend his remaining days at one of the many taxpayer-supported resorts that we have afforded to our political class. Because you know what? Compromise to me is a word that should only be used in hell or in a whorehouse, because when you compromise your principles, you have sold your soul.
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson said it well. He said, in matters of fashion, swim with the tide. In matters of principle, stand like a rock.
Yeah.
That's the only way to do it.
That's exactly right. And if we were to have our public servants at all levels, in all offices, actually hold on to the principles that they believe in, whatever it is, Democrat, Republic, whatever they feel like is the proper principle that they want to hold on to, if they would hold on to their principle and understand that debate and dissension is a critical part of our constitutional Republican form of government, then they would only come to a very limited amount of agreement, and that represents limited government and increased freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. Janice, if you don't mind, in the time we have left, I'd like to touch on something else that I think will be of interest to your listeners, and that is that the things that we've been speaking about with regard to the true nature of the income tax, are not theoretical. The actual structure of the tax, as written and as actually applied, was in fact laid bare 14 years ago when I published my first book, Cracking the Code, The Fascinating Truth About Taxation in America. And almost immediately upon that publication, I became the first American in history to get a complete refund of everything withheld in connection with the income tax, including the nominal federal income taxes and Social Security taxes and Medicare taxes. And since that time, tens of thousands of other Americans have done the same thing, recovering in the aggregate well over $2 billion at this point through a couple of 100,000 refund claims for amounts taken from them in the same fashion that they get taken from everybody else in this country every week, but who had learned what the mechanisms were by which earnings that don't actually qualify for the tax are made subject to it, and knowing how to prevent that from happening. And so they've been getting back all their money.
Wow.
And that's not just from the federal government, that's also from the 36 state governments that also impose an income tax. A number of states don't.
Yeah, I've heard that. Texas doesn't have a state income tax. Yeah, that's one of them. We have a caller on the line. Gary from Hazel Park would like to ask you a question. Let me see if I can get Gary on the line. Gary, are you with us?
Hi, Janice. How are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you, Gary?
Fabulous. Hey, Mr. Hendrickson, I've got a question for you. During your research, have you extrapolated that there's a point in time where critical mass will hit with the abuse of the tax code, and then the whole thing will collapse around us?
The abuse of the tax code to the greatest degree possible has been going on for about 75 years now. And the people doing the abusing are actually very, very sophisticated at balancing the burden and the effect of what they're doing with the tolerance of the system to handle the load. So I don't think that the misapplication of the income tax in and of itself is going to reach some kind of critical tipping point at which it becomes non-viable. The thing that will make that critical tipping point is a growing understanding of the American people of what's going on, of the fact that there's this scheme that's been in place for that 75 years that has been pilfering trillions of dollars out of the pockets of the people to whom it actually belongs, and being used to live very luxurious lives on the part of the people who have been taking it, and also financing all manner of things that most people would view as very, very harmful. Most people would not choose to be paying for the things that a great deal of this money is spent on. That's one of the geniuses of the direct tax concept and the actual proper implementation of indirect taxation, is that people have a far greater choice component in what it is that they will finance. under the income tax misapplication, there is simply a river of money flowing into Washington and into the state houses, and there is no political obligation. Congress could do nothing politically from this point forward, and from back when the misapplication began forward, and would still have this money coming in continuously at all times. Whereas under a direct tax operation, each of those taxes is an independent event. It requires an open vote. It requires a declaration of its purposes and what the tax is being laid on. It's a one-time thing, and then when they need more money, they have to go back and do it again. And this was one of the genius elements of the founders and the framers in setting up the structure the way they did. A huge amount of political accountability, a huge amount of political exposure in order for government to raise money. So if people want the government to have $4.3 trillion, want Washington to have $4.3 trillion to spend doing the various things that it does, parking TSA agents at the airports to frisk people and subject them to virtual strip searches, and funding the NSA to listen in on everybody's email and telephone calls and so forth. If the American people actually want that, then they'll pony up the $4.3 trillion, and they'll do it again next year when it's asked for again. The fact is, Congress knows perfectly well that people will not do that, and so it has created this evasion of those political limits that are constitutionally imposed by this subterfuge of an income tax misapplication that it has successfully been operating now for about 3 generations.
Wow. Gary, did you have a follow-up question?
Not really, but thank you very much.
Well, thank you for calling, Gary. We always enjoy hearing from you. Pete, it is true that we are a tolerant people, and we're more, as it says in the Declaration of Independence, we're more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they're accustomed. We've grown accustomed to this tyranny. We've grown accustomed to being slaves in our own free country.
Oh, no, we have not.
Oh, yes, we have.
Janice, some people have.
Yes.
There's no question about it. Some people are very comfortable. But the reason that they are, I think, is not because they're acclimated to serfdom. It's because the system is very, very sophisticated at, as I was saying in response to Gary, at balancing the burden, at doing sales pitches so that it has a wonderful PR department. I mean, it owns the equivalent of Hollywood and a good part of Hollywood itself,
right,
as its booster and its apologist. And so it's very good at these things, and the answer to those things is simply knowledge. It's education. It's information that people don't have. They don't understand what the loss that they're suffering, the opportunity cost. I recently wrote a paper on the opportunity cost that an average new worker today, young person in their early 20s, starting out in the job market in their career, the opportunity cost that they will suffer throughout the course of their working lives as a consequence of paying FICA taxes, the Social Security and Medicare, versus not paying them and being able to use that money for other purposes. Were that burden not placed on people, which will end up resulting, as is actuarially projected, it resulting in about a $545,000 net. We'll call it a benefit for purposes of conversation here. Over the course of the remainder of their lives, they would end up with $2.5 million instead.
Wow.
If they weren't subjected to that limitation. So people don't understand what it is they're giving up to have the things that they are sold, and they're just sales pitch stuff. The idea that this is better to have the structure that we have now as opposed to a structure of freedom. It's just a sales pitch. It's a snow job is what it is.
Right, right. Well, you wrote another book called Was Grandpa Really a Moron? Critical Inquiries for a New American Century. And that's kind of a fascinating look at if you think that what is happening in today's tax structure is what the founders wanted, or what even our grandfathers wanted for our free country, you've got the wrong idea. They knew what they were doing, they knew what they wanted, and they knew that the construction of the Constitution was a solid, concrete, limiting tool against an overbearing government. And today we have an overbearing government.
Yeah. We, as I said before, in the 40s, there was a kind of a perfect storm moment for a transformation of the relationship of citizen and government in this country. We had World War II going on. We had it was the tail end of, or about to be the tail end of a long period of depression. The beginning of mass media marketing in the form of radio, which was being capitalized by FDR very successfely.
Right.
We had the first generation of American adults at that point who had been through government schools their entire educations.
Right.
A lot of things had gone on during that period of time that allowed this transformation to take place, an exploitive transformation as a consequence of basically a very ambitious government that saw its moment and took it.
Right, and you're absolutely right. Those tools that they use that you spoke of, all of us in the Patriot movement, all of us that understand liberty and want limited government, understand that the educational institutions have done great damage to our generation and generations after us, and the media has done a horrendous disservice to the people. Television could have been a tool that was used to elevate the average person into a great prosperity and thought processes and philosophies, and instead we went to the basest, and it became, like I said, like Vicki Weaver said, an electronic cesspool. And that's what we have today. And why do the people continue to allow these media moguls to run this country into the ground, Pete? I do not understand it. And what can we do to stop this?
Well, we can take the money away from the state. That's the
Amen.
The primary thing that we can do. It's what the founders intended when they set the structure up. They intended for people to regulate the size of the state by the application of the taxation rules that are in the Constitution.
That's right. That's what we call it, starve the beast. That's exactly what your premise is all about. If we want limited government, we the people limit the money that we give to them, period, pure and simple. And you have a wonderful vehicle with which to do just that, and that's your book, Cracking the Code. And I am so looking forward to your presentation this coming Tuesday at the American Polish Cultural Center. Michigan Conservative Union Southeast Chapter is hosting Pete Hendrickson, author of Cracking the Code, at our meeting. He has a wonderful new presentation that he's developed with PowerPoint slides, and my goal is to get an army of citizens that understand how to give your presentation, Pete, throughout the land, so that we might be the forefront of the new American revolution of ideas to be able to bring us back to the limited government that our founders gave us.
I'm looking forward to being with you in that event on Tuesday, Janice, and I am hoping that it'll successfully inspire another batch of people to stand up and take the same view that you just expressed. So.
I'm hoping so too. And Pete, please be sure to bring a number of your books. I'd like to see if we can get our audience to purchase a copy of your book, and in fact maybe you can give us signed copies. That would be really great. I thank you so much for joining us, Pete. This has been an hour looking at how to starve the beast with Pete Hendrickson, author of Cracking the Code. You can go to his website, losthorizons.com, or you can go to the Abolitionist Round Table website. That's Abolitionist Round Table of Michigan. And I hope that you have enjoyed this show. Have a great day.
The Abolitionist Round Table invites the Wham! Talk 1600 listeners to continue the roundtable discussions by mailing correspondence to Art of Michigan, Post Office Box 135, Garden City, Michigan, 48135.
Or follow Phil and Del at artofmichigan.com. You can also send emails to artofmichigan@hotmail.com. And most of all, continue to listen every Saturday and tell a friend.